good evening, wherever you are. And thank you very much for coming to our webinar today on restoring public trust in elections and a path forward. And we're going to take a look at the South Korean and the elections as case studies for where progress is desired. Now, honest elections are not a bipartisan issue. They're really the key to a stable, consensual society, consensual government. In fact, dishonest elections will destroy a society as sure as anything. Even modern, advanced societies require honest elections, or sometimes have problems with them, and also less advanced societies do as well. If we take South Korea, for example, a very modern country, last April 2020, they had an election and it was marred by serious allegations of fraud involving the voter rolls, early voting, electoral hardware and systems, polling location operations, the voting process itself, the counterfeit votes, the counting process, chain of custody problems all over the place, and then lack of official and judicial response to these allegations that were raised. Now that kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds a little bit like what we experienced. But so now the debate over what has happened is fierce. But when a huge chunk of your public thinks that there's been electoral fraud, that they've been cheated, that's not a good thing. It's dangerous, and this has to be addressed. So we have a good panel today of South Korean and US experts who are going to walk us through what happened, but more important, they're going to focus on how do we go about preventing these kinds of problems in the future. We have some good panelists, but we also have two good keynote speakers. First, we have Representative Park Dae-jul from South Korea, member of the South Korean National Assembly, and then we will have Congressman Mike Johnson, Republican from the state of Louisiana. But first, we're going to start off today with a keynote speech by Mr. Park. We're glad to have him here. Now, Mr. Park is a third-term South Korean National Assemblyman. He's with the main opposition party, the Conservative People Power Party. He was a journalist for almost 25 years with the Seoul Shinmun newspaper, working his way up from reporter to an editor's position. He holds important leadership and committee positions in the People Power Party, and is a strong proponent of electoral reform to bolster transparency and integrity, and ultimately public confidence in South Korea's electoral system. National Assemblyman Park has also, along with 14 co-sponsors, has introduced a law to reform and improve the security of the South Korean electoral system. The bill has been submitted. It still needs to pass, but they've taken a good solid look at what needs to be done in South Korea to make improvements to restore public confidence. So we're grateful to have you here today, Assemblyman Park, and the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
I hear you fine, yes.
Yeah, okay. Good morning. My name is Park Dae-jul, and I am a member of the National Assembly of Republic of Korea. Before we start, I would like to thank the organizers who prepared for today's webinar, and all the participants who have joined the event online. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of the Representative James Michael Johnson of the United States Congress, who will share his insight into the U.S. election system. The recent furor of the elections results in Korea and the U.S., which respectively held their general and presidential elections last year, generated extremely regrettable and wasteful controversies of the fairness of our electoral systems. Such disagreements can prevent us from advancing democracy, promoting political consensus, and bequeathing a bright future to the next generation. The solutions, I'm sure everyone would agree, is to the strengthening of the transparency of the casting of votes and tabulation process so that no one has ground to question the legitimacy of our elections. That realization led me to sponsor the partial amendment to the Public Official Election Act on March 17, which I will briefly explain. In Korea, once all votes are cast, ballot boxes are moved to counting stations where voting machines are used for ballot tabulation. The possibility of the glitches in voting equipment, however, along with the potential security breaches during the transport of the ballot box transportation, have been repeated concerns in our elections. In response, the proposed amendment requires officials to hand count all votes by default and employing mechanical and or electronic devices only as the backup. Another problem is the lack of any provisions that mandate video recording when boxes are transported at the end of the voting. This oversight raises concerns the possible electoral fraud. The partial amendment addresses the issues by requiring the government to capture on video the entire process of transporting ballot boxes. The registration also contains provisions that would help us promote the security and the integrity of the early voting. National Assembly member Park Wan-soo also submitted the separate partial amendment to the Public Officials Election Act with provisions of strengthening our anti-hacking capabilities and installing additional surveillance cameras for monitoring ballot storage areas. Once it passes and the plenary session, this bill will ease the public's concern on and enhance the security of the early voting processes. I hope today's webinar will see an outpouring of constructive suggestions on furthering our integrity of our electoral process. For my part, I am committed to ensure the seamless passage of the proposed partial amendment through the National Assembly. Once again, my gratitude goes to everyone here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, Assemblyman Park. I think what you've described is something that a lot of countries recognize, the importance of having a secure, honest voting process. Additionally, the security that comes of a good chain of custody, where you can see where the vote goes from when it's been cast to when it's been counted, both before that and afterwards. So these are good concrete steps that you've raised, and I would like to note that you've also, as I mentioned earlier, you've got 14 co-sponsors to this bill, and it's worth, particularly for our Korean audience, to look at who they are, see their names, and see some people in the South Korean National Assembly who are sincerely concerned about electoral integrity. Now, I also heard Mr. Park, that you've actually put in a petition into the National Assembly, which actually seeks out public support for this bill. And the Korean process does allow actually a sort of a two-pronged approach. One is submitting a bill through the so-called normal procedure in the National Assembly, but also if the bill is put up as a petition sponsored by the assemblyman that is open for public signature, and if it gets 100,000 signatures, then it gets an expedited treatment, as I understand it, through the National Assembly. So it's for Korean listeners who are watching this, that the petition can be found at the National Assembly website, and there's still a little more time to sign, so people should feel free to do that. Well, so I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Park, for taking the time to come to go to your office in Korea and speak to us. And we look forward to hearing from you again and meeting you sometime. Thank you very much. Okay, well, what we'd like to do now, Congressman Johnson is on his way. He's en route from his office building. But what I'd like to do is to introduce our panelists so we can jump right in once Congressman Johnson has given his speech. And we have, as I mentioned, we have three good expert panelists with us today. And the first one I'd like to introduce is Denise Cohen. She's the director of the American Conservative Union's Center to Protect Voters and Their Voices. The center's mission is to protect the integrity of our electoral system from efforts to undercut electoral integrity, and also to defend against efforts to establish an authoritarian socialist agenda in our nation, which is something that most Americans don't want. And Denise has many years' experience in the private sector as an attorney and a business consultant. Now, our second panelist will be Dr. Choi Wan Mog. And Dr. Choi is a well-recognized scholar and professor of law in South Korea at Ewha Women's University. He is the co-chair of a group called the Professors Solidarity for Freedom and Justice. And this is an organization actually of some thousands of South Korean university professors who were sort of spurred into action by the April 2020 National Assembly election. And I think if you know the academic world, it's rare to have that many professors agree on anything, much less sort of the issue of electoral fraud. So this is quite something to see. As noted, the National Assembly election was marred by many well-documented irregularities. Dr. Choi previously worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in South Korea as a diplomat and a legal officer in charge of many international and trade affairs. He's also a lawyer, and he's been a member of the New York State Bar since 1999. Now, our third panelist is Colonel John Mills, U.S. Army retired. He's a former director of cybersecurity policy, strategy, and international integration in the office of the Chief Information Officer at the Department of Defense. Colonel Mills also has had extensive overseas experience working directly with key partner militaries and governments. He's an expert on psychological warfare, civil affairs, and he's, I think, fair to say he's had an impact on most of the significant national events of the last 35 years. Colonel Mills is an expert also on electoral integrity issues. He recently advised, in fact, a U.S. partner nation, an important partner nation, on electoral security. And it actually had outstanding results because they seem to have followed his recommendations to a T. Colonel Mills is active in efforts to ensure electoral integrity in our own country, and he's been laboring to address and really offer practical solutions at the local level to the structural problems that led to widespread irregularities in the November 2020 U.S. election. Now, you probably may be wondering, how it is that, I'm actually involved in sort of South Korean electoral issues. And it's a sort of an odd, not a funny story, but it's, it's what comes of a liberal arts degree. But, I had heard about the South Korean election and what happened in April 2020. And I was actually sort of skeptical, or just didn't pay much attention, really, because elections often have sort of unexpected outcomes. Everyone remembers that picture, if you're old enough, of President Truman holding up the front page of a newspaper saying that Dewey, Truman's opponent, won. So, I just thought, well, this is what happens. It was a surprising outcome. And then once I started to look into the election in great detail, and I had occasion to speak to many witnesses and review a good bit of the evidence, I came to change my mind, and particularly talking to the evidence that was provided by South Korean citizens. And it was a full range of people, ranging from lawyers to journalists to politicians, statisticians, computer experts, and really just regular citizens. And they were extremely level-headed, and they stuck with what they knew, and they presented their information. And I came to change my mind and really to come around to the belief that, well, there was indeed electoral fraud. This is it's a useful case study, and you heard me mention earlier the areas in which there were extreme irregularities in the South Korean election. This took place 6 months before the U.S. election, and you can see the similarities. But let me give Congressman Johnson's introduction, and then we'll hear from him, and then we'll get into the discussion. Thanks for your flexibility on this. Now, Representative Mike Johnson currently represents the 4th Legislative District of Louisiana. He's currently the Vice Chairman of the House Republican Conference and also the Assistant Whip of the 117th Congress, and he was formerly the past Chairman of the Republican Study Committee. Congressman Johnson is a constitutional law expert and serves on the House Judiciary Committee and the House Armed Services Committee. He's widely recognized as a leading defender of religious freedom, freedom of speech, the Second Amendment, and free market principles. He's a key advocate of electoral integrity, a strong supporter of that. He was also one of 127 members of the House of Representatives who in December 2020 signed on to the amicus brief filed in the case called the State of Texas versus Pennsylvania. And this was a lawsuit filed at the United States Supreme Court contesting the results of the 2020 presidential election. And it was good to have a constitutional law expert signing on to that, and that says plenty. So we're very grateful to have Congressman Johnson join us today.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I was a moment late. I was actually in the room next door. Ironically enough, we have the Constitution Subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee in the midst of a hearing. I'm the top Republican, the ranking member there, so I just had to give our opening statement. And the subject of that hearing is the need to enhance the Voting Rights Act here in the U.S., preliminary injunctions, election observers, and notice. But as I just pointed out to my colleagues here, we have a big political battle going on in the United States right now, as you all know, between our parties, and the Democrats, our colleagues here on this committee and throughout the Congress, have an ulterior motive, I believe, and I just pointed it out in my opening statement just a moment ago, that they are trying to federalize all of our elections in the United States. And that's a gross violation of our traditions and the text of the Constitution itself, because we give the 50 individual states here the responsibility to administer our elections. And that has always been the way it's been done in this country. In fact, it's right in the text of the Constitution itself. It's in Article 2, near the top of our constitutional text, the first section and the second clause there, that gives our 50 state legislatures the ability. We entrust them with the integrity of our election system. We give them the exclusive authority to direct the manner of appointing presidential electors, for example, for the Electoral College. That's how we choose, of course, our commander-in-chief here. And that's a really important provision of the Constitution. The Supreme Court in the United States has said very clearly that this power is, quote, placed absolutely and wholly with the legislatures, and it can neither be taken away nor abdicated. That was in a Supreme Court case back in 1892, McPherson versus Blacker. Every state's legislature, thus, has a long established set of detailed rules and procedures to determine their electors. However, as we all know, in the months preceding the 2020 presidential election here, those rules and procedures were changed in some of the states, not by the legislatures, as we just established the Constitution requires, but by a variety of other officials, including governors and secretaries of state, elections officials, judges, sometimes activists in the various states. And these included, but are not limited to, the following irregularities. In the state of Pennsylvania, for example, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court unilaterally extended the deadline to receive absentee and mail-in ballots to 3 days after the election day. The Pennsylvania Secretary of State dismissed signature authentication procedures for absentee and mail-in ballots. The Secretary of State there also allowed certain counties, majority Democrat leaning, by the way, to notify voters of errors in their ballots, allowing them to request a replacement or to vote provisionally. In the state of Arizona, the federal district court, in agreement with the Secretary of State there, made last-minute extensions to the voter registration deadline all the way to October 15th, just 3 weeks before the election day. And again, the state legislature had no say in that whatsoever. It was done by these other officials. In the state of Minnesota, a state court consent decree allowed for the counting of ballots received up to a week after election day if they were postmarked by election day. The legislature had nothing to say about it. In Michigan, the Detroit election officials mailed out unsolicited absentee ballot applications. No state law provided for that. In Maryland, 2 district judges in Maryland relaxed the signature requirements for candidates to get on the ballot. In Virginia, a district judge nullified the witness requirement for absentee ballots in both the primary and general elections. There are many, many examples that I could cite. The point is that all of those were clearly on their face unconstitutional irregularities, and it led to chaos in the election outcome. And we all saw the results of that. Now, back in December, on December 10th, I drafted and led an amicus brief. I used to be a constitutional law attorney before I got to Congress, and am accustomed to litigating cases like this in the courts. And so we filed, a friend of the court, an amicus brief in the United States Supreme Court in the famous Texas case, where Texas tried to intervene to stop some of this. It was the only vehicle before the court, before the actual election would be certified and the electoral count done in January. And so on behalf of 126 members of Congress who signed on to that, we filed a brief to the court December 10th and said, please address this central issue. No matter what you do with the Texas litigation and the lawsuit they filed, at least, we asked our 9 justices of our Supreme Court, at least look at this issue. Was the clear language of Article 2 of our Constitution violated or not? And as I've just illustrated to you, the answer is very, very clear. Unfortunately for us, as you all know, our court denied review of that issue. They determined that the state of Texas did not have standing. In other words, that the lawsuit could not remain in the Supreme Court, and they kicked it out. And so that is what led to the ultimate chaos that we saw. So because of all that, and because of the mess that we had, because of the irregularities, some of my colleagues here, some of the Democrats, the liberals in the United States Congress, are trying to codify and make permanent many of these changes. They love the outcome and how this went down in some of these states, and so they want to make that, the permanent situation. And we are arguing that that should not happen. So we have many states, as you know, that are engaging in reform efforts, and several great ideas have been suggested. Many of them have been created, put into legislation. At last count, there were well over 300 pieces of legislation pending in the various state legislatures, many of whom are in session as we speak. And those include mandating voter identification, prohibiting the sending of unrequested ballots, also known as universal mail-in voting, keeping up-to-date voter rolls and removing those who no longer live in the state there or have not voted in several recent elections. There are some bills that have been passed and are being debated to prohibit ballot harvesting, which is a terrible practice, or the collection of ballots by third parties to return to precincts. There's bills to require the counting of ballots to be completed on or shortly after Election Day, which is, of course, a common sense measure. Amending early voting days to be those most beneficial to voters. Monitoring drop boxes that are not located inside election precincts. In some of our states, they had drop boxes in public parks. They were unmanned. It was what could go wrong, we asked. Reducing wait times at voting precincts by creating more of them, restricting who can approach voters who are in line to vote, and mandating allowing campaign representatives to observe the vote counting process. Again, these are common sense measures. If you polled average everyday American citizens and said, does this make sense? Would this help us secure our elections? Most all of them would, of course, say, yes, it would. But they politicize this, and that's the very unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in today. Now, many of these states have already passed these laws. Some of them have been signed into law. Most recently, in the state of Iowa, the election reform package was signed into law March 8th. In Georgia as everyone knew, March 25th, much maligned by the mainstream media in America, they passed a great package of reforms. And in Florida, Governor DeSantis signed it into law May 6th. There are many other states at various stages of considering these things, and we are certainly hopeful that it will happen. I will close with this, and I know that there will be questions and more discussion, but our extraordinary republic, I'm going to give you the same closing remark that I just gave just a few moments ago in the committee next door, because I believe this is what the American people need to hear. And I hope that the people of South Korea are similarly encouraged, because I believe, and my colleagues here believe, I'm the vice chairman of the House Republican Conference. I can speak on behalf of all my colleagues on this side, that we believe that our extraordinary republic here has endured now for almost 2.5 centuries. July 4th will be our 245th birthday as a nation. But a republic, as you know, is a very fragile thing. But we can endure. We have to remember that we endure and have endured for almost 2.5 centuries here, in large part on the understanding that our elections will be free and fair and secure. And that security is essential. The ballot box is deemed to be a sacrosanct, almost a sacred exercise, the voting that we have here. And our Constitution and these institutions will endure, but they will only endure if leaders like us and leaders like you are willing to support and defend them. And that has never been more important than it is right now in this moment. So I am really grateful to CPAC and to all of you for your interest in this issue, for your endeavors and your hard-fought efforts there to hold the freedom that you have. We'll all defend it together. We're in it with you. We see ourselves in that way, and we want to be a resource to you in any way that we can. And I'm really honored to be participating with you today.
Well, thank you very much, sir. We appreciate it. And it certainly gets across just the fundamental importance of a fair election to any sort of decent, consensual society. Take it away, and it's gone. In some respects, maybe this last brouhaha that we had after this election, maybe it's woken people up and I think focused more attention on the importance of free and fair elections, particularly at every level, but not least at the local level, for all the way up to the top. So we appreciate you coming, and we appreciate your you're being a stalwart on behalf of sort of honest elections. So thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. And now what we're going to do is we're going to jump into the panel session, and we've already introduced our panelists, and so we'll just say move right in as soon as we get things set up. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Grant Newsham. I'm the president of KCPAC, which is the Korean Conservative Political Action Committee Conference, excuse me. And I'm obviously an American. Used to be a lawyer. I still am a lawyer, actually. Like 2 out of 3 Americans. Used to be with the Marines, was a diplomat, worked for an investment bank with many years in Asia, etc. So that's me. But I want to hear from you all. And so I want to make the most of what we can with our time. And so what I'd like to do is to start, ask a question. And I'd like to look back, actually, at what happened in the election. And everyone has a sense of it. But I'd like to know, what was it that got you individually? What got your attention in terms of the idea that something happened that wasn't good in the election, and you needed to do something about it? So let's start with Denise, if we could. What was it that sort of woke you up here?
Well, it started personally as I saw a change in the media, the way that things were being covered. You could see that there was a very clear bias against President Trump. And a lot of people that supported him were troubled by the disclosures that were not happening, the manipulation of information, the big tech censorship. And so I got involved with the litigation that was taking place. I was analyzing a lot of the pre-election litigation as well as the post-election. And I was stunned, as Representative Johnson said it, I was stunned to see the extent of litigation that was taking place across the country, changing the laws, getting through in what we would consider an unconstitutional manner. and getting through with it. And what these laws did, just to back it up, and each state votes itself. This is not a popular election in this country, so each state holds its own elections. Each state has their own laws. These laws were being changed in the name of the pandemic to make it easier to vote, which it's a good cause, but they were doing it at the cost of safeguards. So the guardrails were coming down, and more people were able to vote, possibly many times. I mean, the election turnout was at the highest level we've ever seen before. And so it was clearly happening in a way that was never intended to take place. And that was the first wake-up call. There's a lot more that I can talk about and we'll get into later on, but I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I want to hear more. Professor Choi.
Yes.
Now, you're in South Korea, and the election happens on April 15th, 2020. What was your response to that? What was your because obviously something got your attention. Could you describe what it was?
First of all, thank you very much, Grant, for your promotion for our petition for the amendment bill for the Election Management Act. I think that's a pretty important issue in Korea. And I fully agree with the Congressman Johnson. This is not a political issue. It should be very much bipartisan issue. The very much important impact was made April 15 last year, when people saw the statistics from the early voting result, particularly. That statistics showed an unacceptable degree of artificial manipulation. In most of the electoral districts, the number of early vote was consistently about 12% higher than the regular vote for the ruling party candidates, whereas that of the main opposition party candidate was consistently lower by 12%. So, which gives the more than 20% advantage for the ruling party candidate. That kind of difference was very much regular, and in some districts that statistics was very much paradoxical. And a lot of evidence is out there. Both counting machines were malfunctioning, always to the benefit of ruling party candidates. Many early voting ballot papers were out of standard format. Seals or ballot boxes were taken off or damaged. Security cameras in early voting stations were ordered to cover up by the National Election Commission officials. It was very much shocking. QR code was used against the law for early voting, instead of barcode, etc., etc. QR code is more difficult to verify later on. So I think at least to the intellectuals or experts or scholars or some people who are interested in that issue, credibility of entire election management system in Korea is in very much controversy now. That could be explaining the entire picture, what happened in last election.
Well, thank you. I remember when I did the research into the Korean election, that one of the people I spoke with was the former president of what is effectively South Korea's MIT. And he commented regarding the statistics and the statistical outcome. He said, look, either God did it or the election was fraudulent. And that,
not only him.
Not inclined to challenge him, but say there was just one bit of evidence that raises a lot of concern and also gives some credibility to these allegations. Now, John, I'd like to hear from you. I imagine you probably smelled something going on, probably long before voting day, I should think. But what was it that attracted your attention about this election?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Grant. It's an honor to be with everybody here today. So I really go back to the Virginia Assembly elections in November of 2019. 2 years ago, I didn't think I'd be spending all this time understanding the election process. In America, it's all about the counties. There's 3,000 plus counties, and really, there's really about 30 to 40 that are really the issue across America. But it's all about the county, unless, God forbid, HR 1 revives itself like a zombie and comes back at us again. So it's all about the counties, the counties, the counties, the counties in America. But that vote just made no sense. And I did some research. I organized a group. We started looking into it. And just one of the techniques was getting the jury duty rejections from the county court, which are taken by law from where the actual voting rolls. And just by that, 8 to 12% were unlawful through various, there's 20 rejection categories, and through just 4 of the basic, there's 4 that would 8 to 12% unlawful in a federal election. Very important distinguisher. So that really initiated. That's where I got to know people like Keith Lewis, Russ Ramsland, started getting involved. We knew something was up, and we knew that things were not going well. I wrote a bunch of memos, but I think also historically you have to look at the January vote in Taiwan. And Taiwan was extremely effective at shutting down the Chinese. I call it influence money, or it's a term of art in the community is called walking around money. And so they passed a national security law in December, made a bunch of arrests of people who were obviously on the take with the communist Chinese, and they ran the election as absolutely simple as possible. The machines did nothing but count a vote. There was none of this silliness of fractional apportionment or cute features inside an election machine. And they did it, both parties, transparently on a Jumbotron, showing the ballot, showing everybody the ballot, what was marked. They would pass it through the machine. They would hand count, hand tabulate everybody. There was like triple, quadruple, double check, corroboration, and they nailed it. Well, that really angered the communist Chinese. So who did they take it out on? They took it out on Korea in April. So April, that's when the Koreans really bore the brunt of this. And there was thousands of communist Chinese operatives flown in by Moon Jae-in and their cooperation with the communist Chinese. It was an absolute scam orchestrated at the highest levels. And then again, who got it next? Well, the United States in November. But what we learned, I think the key thing, and that's what we're taking into effect for the November elections in Virginia, is it's all about citizen involvement. We're putting together a film called FOIA File, Sue and Settle, which is a repeatable model for the citizen to reinsert themselves into the election process in America. And again, it's all about the county. I was able to get my county election official resign with a nominal amount of questions. Everybody needs to hold these elected and appointed officials accountable. And if they're, and you have an absolute right to question them. And so again, I was very easily able to force my election commissioner to resign. That wasn't my intent, but obviously something's up, and I've clamped onto that, and I'm not going to let go until we get truth on that.
Now, Denise, what after what have you all done? Now, I like that. What was your reaction after the November election? And I think a lot of us thought that, well, somehow somebody's going to come fix it, or we're going to get clarity on what happened. What happened? Because we were watching, and it just looked like nobody ever came to really dig into it. It just looked like a big mess. Well,
from the legal side, there was a lot of activity. There were hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits that were filed. And the biggest frustration, of course, was that no court would hear it. I think there was a case in Nevada that made it to court. But other than that, nothing made it through. So there's piles and piles of evidence that nobody's ever heard or seen, which would have shed some light on what actually happened. And there's no question, we're not going to spend any time talking about, machines malfunctioning, and because the real problem here in America was the playing around with the laws. And that's what's continuing today. So in, I think, 2005, there was a commission that was done. It was James Baker and Jimmy Carter. and it had to do with election security. And the one thing that they kept pointing out was that mail-in ballots were the most susceptible to fraud and error. And what we saw as a result of the laws that were artificially changed, let's say, for the pandemic, was an unprecedented increase, not just in turnout, but in voting by mail. And let me look at my numbers. Yeah, it was in 2016, 21% of the vote was by mail. In 2020, 46%. None of these counties, none of these election offices were prepared for the onslaught of mail-in ballots. They didn't know how to count them. They didn't know how to process them. They didn't know how to cure them when ballots came in with mistakes. And so as a result, we really don't know what happened. And poll after poll after poll shows us that Americans are not trusting of these elections. I think something like 60% of Americans don't trust the polls. Mm-hmm. So we did what we normally do, which is we turned to the courts, and we're tremendously disappointed by what happened. And the big danger with the courts not listening, and this includes the Supreme Court, which doesn't really want to weigh in on election matters. The problem is all of this stuff has been left out there kind of rotting. And there's a narrative that's taking place now, which says, well, the court said that there was nothing wrong. This was the most secure election ever. This couldn't be further from the truth. But it's sort of metastasizing. And it's enabling things like what Representative Johnson was talking about earlier, the federal takeover of our elections. Because they're saying it was, it was all wrong, and now we know how to come in and save it and all the rest of it. It's kind of terrifying to see our country in this condition under the guise of laws. I don't know how else to say it. Does that answer what you were?
It helps. It was sort of in line with what I observed. I think a lot of people observed. I was always one noted how these cases never got to court, or if they did, they were dismissed on a procedural grounds, but never heard on the merits. And what you've described is the narrative that the one side puts out, well, rejected by the court, but without asking, well, they didn't actually look at the facts. One other thing which really surprised me, because I follow elections, but not like I follow basketball. But I was asking after this one, I asked a retired FBI agent who's a friend. I said, well, why don't you guys do something about this? Because there's obviously credible allegations. And I had this image of a sort of a task force or a flying squad of Department of Justice lawyers backed up with FBI agents that would go out to these places, Detroit, wherever, and investigate these crimes. And he says, or these allegations, and he says, well, no, the Department of Justice has been unwilling to prosecute voter fraud at the federal level for decades. And if they don't prosecute it, we don't investigate it. And that was one of the biggest surprises that really struck me, is that there's no federal real oversight of the whole thing, where you go and dig into these, these sort of swamps where you just have fraud that is what looks like fraud that is so commonsensical, and there really was nobody who investigates it except some overmatched local people, and it's so I was disappointed by what I saw. I think like a lot of people. So what you say just seconds what I.
Well, and there are audits that have been taking place. They've been hard fought, and it's not really clear how accurate these audits are, what they will yield, because the truth is the election was lost when the laws were changed. Whatever we can uncover at this point really doesn't reverse the damage.
Yeah, it did strike me that once the election is held, that it's just almost impossible within that short notice, with the resources available and the way it's structured, to actually come up with something that's going to overturn the election. Just my sense. But Professor Choi, going back to South Korea, after this election happened, and by the way, it was an election which gave the ruling party, which is a leftist party, it gave them a supermajority in the National Assembly, which allows them to pass any law they want, peel off 3 votes, and you can revise the Constitution. And there were, of course, if you saw the statistics and the way it worked out, it was pretty darn coincidental. that they won the way they did. But you look at the payoff. But in South Korea, what was the government's response when people like you and your group raised these allegations? Did you get any help or traction or attention?
Yeah. By the way, the ruling party took 180 seats out of 300, so it became supermajority ruling party indeed. Interestingly enough, government as well as ruling party leadership and prosecution and National Election Commission have not taken any direct and open position about this issue or any law enforcement measures on the protesters. So I think silence and non-provocation probably seem to be their strategy, deliberately chosen. I think that's a very strange thing happening here. A lot of defamation, a lot of citizens indicated specific person as the criminal who is responsible for the organized crime of election fraud, but still no counterclaim or anything is going on in Korea. So similarly to the United States, here in Korea, in nearly half of all the electoral precincts, legal challenges were filed by citizens and several opposition party candidates who lost the election, of course. But the trial, differently from the United States, trial have been delayed by the Supreme Court for more than 1 year, which is beyond the 6-month deadline prescribed in the law. So that delay itself is illegal. In the meantime, students and citizens who do not know each other, they have been gathering in almost every weekend at the various locations, including Gangnam, district of Seoul, wearing black outfits, holding black umbrella. You see the picture there, black umbrella. So they held numerous round of street demonstrations protesting against election fraud, of course. Numerous social organizations, including My Professor Solidarity, having the membership of more than 6,000 full-time professors in Korea. And military generals, retired military generals organization, retired diplomat organization, Seoul National University Alumni Organization, and Christian churches joining that protest. So this kind of Black Street movement has become a new culture in Korea. By the way, many Koreans residing in overseas join this event wearing the black at their respective locations, including United States, Australia, and Japan. So when this movement started to get momentum nationwide and overseas, unluckily or strangely, or it was coincidence, COVID-19 regulations stepped in. So holding massive protests, it's becoming really difficult and even illegal. So I think now the protest is continuing on a small group basis. Experts and intellectuals published several reports, including yourself, right? Inside and outside Korea, indicating the conclusion of electoral fraud. But as I said, silence and non-provocation is the basic strategy by the government.
Yeah, I believe there were about 140 lawsuits filed after the South Korean elections, which is far and away more than has ever been filed. And of those, only one has been brought anywhere near completion, and that was just a recount that was carried out the other day. But the law requires that within 180 days you have to resolve these cases. None of them were done, and that does speak for itself. The government has also used sort of pressure against its opponents and against the media that might otherwise cover it to the extent they have any interest. But it's a familiar sort of behavior that you see in Belarus or White Russia, Zimbabwe or anywhere. It's funny that even successful countries, modern countries, face the exact same problems that third world countries do, such as life. And John, what was your, you would have some perspectives on all of this, on sort of the post-election.
We need to. All citizens need to get involved. There needs to be a clamor for forensic audits everywhere. And let me address one thing. The federal law, there's very little federal law on the conduct of voting. And again, unless, God forbid, H.R. 1 passes, there's 18 U.S. code, must be a U.S. citizen, 52 U.S. code, retention of ballots, and the Motor Voter Act of 93, have a 2002, but there's actually very little on the mechanics. Again, it's all about the counties. And as Denise had mentioned here, there was in Virginia a change in the laws. In my specific county, which I'm using as an exemplar in the state and nationwide, 74% of the votes, 74% of the votes in my county, with the new laws set up because of the virus in the summer of 2020, 74% of the votes were absentee. That meant they were mailed in. They were mailed in ones and twos and hundreds and thousands. They were dropped off. You could drop off 5, you could drop off 10. There's absolutely no control measure. So that meant day of voting is irrelevant. Okay, that's very significant. And that's the problem is there's a lot of groups that are looking the wrong way, in the wrong direction, for the wrong information and the wrong issue. In Virginia now, the way it's set up, it's all about the central absentee precinct, which I have often called the central counting facility. Very poorly supervised, there was no two-party control for 80% of the time. At the end of the day, the thumb drives would be taken out of the machines. Usually the thumb drives should never leave the machines. They're there solely for backup and emergency, but the machines would leave. There was no documentation of the vote at the end of the day. There was no documentation on what happened in the morning when the thumb drives were put back in. Where did they go? What network were they plugged into? Nobody knew. And again, now part of that is the fault of the Republican Party, their total failure to deploy their resources in the right direction for the right issue. So again, in Virginia, it's all about these central absentee precincts, and we have to mass all attention on those for the upcoming election. It's all about the central absentee precincts and the malfeasance that clearly was taking care of that. It was a circus. And so my attitude is I'm not going to spend time complaining. I want to get to what's right and the way we should be conducting elections. So the two parties, the Republicans need to get their act together and make sure they have proper representation. But these are the mechanics of how elections are lost. We had a spike in the morning of November 4th. Part of that was the mysterious departure of the thumb drives the evening of the 3rd, and then the reinsertion on the morning of the 4th. That's what gave you that statistical spike. But again, that's where it is. That's where the action is in Virginia. But we want to train everybody to retake their counties.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I'd like to sort of spend some time on, is actually looking forward, because to me, it's at least half the population that knows that something happened that wasn't good, and I'll bet a lot of the other half will grudgingly admit it too in certain circumstances. What do we do actually to restore the integrity in the system? Now, because I'm guilty as anyone. I'm pretty good at complaining about what happened. But what are the actual steps that we can take as as part of an organization or individually? How do we make sure that something like this doesn't happen again, and sort of claw back our sense of an honest election? And Denise, because I know you all are actually doing it. You're a group that does something.
Well, we are, and we have a lot of great activists that want to get in on the fight. And so, to John's point, this is really, regular citizens have to step up. The first thing that people need to do is be informed as to what's going on. And if you look on our website, we actually have a tracker with all of the state election laws, everything that was on the books by state prior to 2020, the changes that took place during 2020 as a result of the pandemic, and then proposed changes or new changes that are being made to state law in 2021, some of which have passed, some of which have not. You've all heard about the pushback on some of those laws that have passed. Georgia is the biggest one, and if anybody didn't see it, on Friday, the Department of Justice sued the state of Georgia, claiming in part that the Georgia common sense election reforms that were passed in March were discriminatory. And what they are actually trying to do with that is kind of in collusion, I shouldn't say collusion, but in concert with Democrats, is a federal takeover of our elections, whereby they point to some of the activity that took place and say, okay, this is voter suppression, you're discriminating against minorities, and you're trying to make sure that people don't have access to ballots. If you take a look at what the state reforms and many of the laws that are already on the books are doing, are really, the goal is make it easy to vote, but hard to cheat. What is happening at the federal level, the attempts that have been referred to so far, HR1, S1, those things are not getting out of, S1 failed the other day. What is happening on the left, though, is an attempt to bring forth Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, the Voting Rights Act is something that goes back to the Civil Rights Movement, when an ugly chapter of our country, minorities, slaves, didn't have the right to vote. And then when Black people eventually did get the right to vote, many of the former Confederate states were, playing, free and easy with some of the laws, and it was difficult. There were legitimate problems. And as a result, many of those states were put under Department of Justice scrutiny, and laws that they wanted to change had to be cleared by the Department of Justice. In 2013, this made it up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said the numbers just don't add up anymore. We don't see this type of discrimination. Turnout is exceptionally high among all the groups. It's been increasing, and as a result, this pre-clearance requirement, which kind of puts a clamp on a state's ability to make laws, is no longer constitutional. What's now happening at the federal level is an attempt to bring that back, to put all states that have actually, there's a way that they would try to get every single state to have laws approved by the Department of Justice, by the Attorney General. So if you want to move a polling place from the cafeteria to the library, that would have to get approval from the Attorney General. It's craziness. And all it's meant to do really is just block the elections and control them. So the fight is on. It's going to take place in the courts. It's going to take place at the legislatures. And we have to make sure that citizens that care, which I believe most Americans do, we just want to live good, honest lives. They need to be involved and let their congressmen, let their legislators, let their senators know that they want honest, fair, transparent elections that they can believe in. We don't always get the elected officials that we want, but we can live with it if we think that the result was fair. Mm-hmm. If you look back, the Washington Post, which is no friend of conservatives, came out with an article showing that the presidential election was swung by less than 43,000 votes. It was 3 states where the margin of error was less than 0.6%. A difference there would have swung it to President Trump. He would have been reelected. It's that narrow, with all of the chaos, with the increase in, the mail votes, with all of that, it was just less than 43,000 votes. And so I think we know where the country is. The question is, are we motivated enough to fight? Because the elections and the elected officials is just one part of what is taking over right now and really reshaping our country in a way that we cannot accept.
Mm-hmm. So John, I know that your group is doing some very, I'd call it sort of work at the mine face or the cold face of electoral reform. And I've seen some of the reports that you put out, and it looks like a good systematic approach to it. Could you just describe it a little bit? And also, once again, it's, what would you tell, say, the average citizen who wants to get involved? And I think Denise's idea of, talking to your congressman, letting him know what you think is a pretty easy thing to do. And you saw with Congressman Johnson that, it can be effective when these guys know they have some support. But John, what would you
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Grant. It is at the county level again, holding, the citizen must understand the mechanics of the voting process. It's only about 30 of these 3,000 plus counties that are really questionable and have become essentially perverted by a gross malfeasance. So you have to know your officials. You have to know you have to know the state law. In Virginia, it's 24.2 of the code. citizens can actually see these laws and read them themselves. They do not need a lawyer. And actually, an average citizen with passion and energy can actually cause great impact. So again, our process is FOIA, file, sue, and settle to decisively reinsert the citizen back into the election process. And again, with just a nominal amount of inquiries, my own county election official resigned because of my inquiry. So something clearly was up and is up in Prince William County, Virginia. So these appointed and elected officials have to know that people are asking questions. Get to know the judges at the county level. Some states are appointed, some states are elected. You can do something called an office call. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be a high priest of knowing statute at the state or federal level. Oftentimes these judges actually really appreciate an informed citizen coming in and articulating a reasonable observations on the process. Now, if you are beginning to get the grounds to move forward to the sue stage, that specific judge may have to recuse themselves. That's okay. But you have successfully developed and shaped the situation, and that's where you decisively put the right pressure on the right target. In military terms and targeteers, it's putting the right ordnance on the right target. And it's amazing what happens when the common citizen, again, everybody thinks this takes $1 bazillion and an army of lawyers. No, it doesn't. It takes an average citizen actually cracking open the state code and again, there's very little federal law, but it's really about the state and the county. And again, at the federal level, and I know Chris Krebs and I know CISA and DHS, they were hapless. They were, and Chris Krebs told truth in about February of 21 when he came back after leaving office, thank God, that he didn't have enough people, programs, or resources, which is what he should have said in November instead of saying this was the fairest election ever. His most honest answer should have been, I don't really know. I don't have the people, programs, or resources to have an opinion one way or another. FBI is not trained in this. And again, the Voting Rights Act was brought up, which Virginia is still under portions of the Voting Rights Act. But citizens, this is a wake-up call. Everybody assumed somebody else was taking care of the election. Yes, somebody else was taking care of the election.
Yeah, I'd noticed that beforehand that the Democrats had 650 lawyers standing by to go into action. I said, well, there must be some Republicans there, but I kind of knew there may not have been. But the point is that taking action is the thing, and we've tended to expect others to do it. You mentioned Chris Krebs, who I believe was the Department of Homeland Security cybersecurity guy. Yeah. And I remember his statement that this was the most secure election ever. And then like 2 weeks later, the Russians or somebody, the Russians or the Chinese pulled off the most impressive hack of US government systems that you could even dream of. And they've been doing it for a good long while. It just happened to get detected. So his statement, the most secure election ever, maybe not. Now, Professor Choi, back to Korea, because we talk, we're probably, you may be wondering, well, why is Korea important? And I'll just, one, I'd like to have a question for you, but I would, for Americans, think about the U.S.-Korea relationship. It underpins security in Northeast Asia, and it doesn't get mentioned much, but the nature of Korean leftists is that these people are anti-American, pro-North Korea, pro-China, and they would like the Americans to leave Korea, ultimately. And if you can get in a one-party state that wins every election forever, well, that you can see the dangers there. And one way to get that is to rig the electoral system. But Professor Choi, what would you see as the future for the South Korean election process and the efforts to try and clean it up and get it back to where it was, because it was a very admirable one, very impressive, but something happened. What would you see as the future?
Yeah, I think Korean current leadership in government or ruling party, particularly, they are learning very quick from, what can I say, the Chinese style of totalitarianism that is very effective in controlling the society and maintaining their power. So I think pro-China policy of current government is very much in line with the election fraud issue. As Mr. Mills, I think he emphasized. So I think not only for Korea, but for the United States, I think IT technology is very good and very evil, depending on how humans use. That is why particularly Korea and the United States are vulnerable and will be more vulnerable to such evil technology, combined by the totalitarian style of government. So I think verification and full transparency are only insurance mechanism, as many people emphasized, unless we change the entire system to manual voting and manual counting system. If you go to the Alexandria area in DC vicinity, there is a Freemason Museum. I think founding fathers of the United States used the manual voting and counting system, using the wooden box, casting the crystal balls inside the box. So I think that is the answer. I think. Let me tell you briefly what's happening now. It's a very important issue. Actually, yesterday, for the first time in over 1 year period after legal claims were filed, recount was actually conducted by the Supreme Court, finally, in only one designated constituency. Any types of recording were not allowed during the verification process by the court, and only limited time and facilities were provided for the recounting process. The focus of verification was given to 3 stages, all in 1 day period. Number 1, sorting out invalid ballot by observation by human eyes. Number 2, QR code verification, which is only for 50-minute time. And number 3, recounting process, which lasted, I think, 6 or 7 hours. So I think it is truly problematic how human eyes can sort out all invalid or suspicious ballot in such a short time. Today, a piece of news is heard through the SNS by complaining party lawyers that numerous ballot papers were found that do not fit with the standard specification and colors. However, only 294 ballots among those numerous ballots were decided invalid by the court. QR code verification stage is no less problematic in Korea. After scanning image files of early voting ballots, those files will be compared to the image files stored in the server of National Election Commission and see whether there is any meaningful difference. This job is supposed to be done in a couple of days from now on. I mean, given that such a long time has already passed since the legal claim was made, right? Is it possible that the image files stored in the server might have been already replaced? How can one guarantee those files are the original ones that were actually stored 14 months ago without proper forensics? Plus, what if those files saved 14 months ago were manipulated by programmers or Chinese, hackers or some people to begin with? So given this limited scope of verification and poor transparency, I think many people, intelligent people in Korea, are in very much doubt whether ultimate truth can be found by even the Supreme Court. As lawmaker Park told, one bill of amendment of election law was introduced in Korean Congress, requesting introduction of basically manual counting system and enhanced transparency And my organization, I mean, Professor Solidarity, has proposed to introduce post-election audit mechanism, probably taking example of the American system, but I think your system has some kind of problems. So I think we will look at your procedure and see how those problems can be fixed.
Okay, well, thank you. It's maybe one good thing of the Korean experience is that so much attention was paid on this election that it sometimes will cause the bad guys to back off. And my group, the KCPAC, and also One Korea Network, which are affiliate, we actually put together in 2 volumes all the evidence that was uncovered, all the analysis, the assessments, and it's available. It's in hard copy, but also online at onekoreanetwork.com, onekoreanetwork.com. And we put it out, we put it together so that we could memorialize and save the evidence. So this thing didn't just turn into a legend after time passes, but we put the evidence together. It is available for people to read, scrutinize, refute, or verify, however. But that was our intention in doing this, is to make sure that they say this didn't just become a legend, but the evidence is there and it's to be reviewed. But we're looking, there's a presidential election coming in Korea next year, and this will be very interesting to see just how this works. So we're coming to the end, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to have everybody take 1 minute, and this is your chance to speak to both the Americans and the Koreans. If you could just sort of fire away with what you think is important. And Denise, would you go first, please?
Sure, and Grant, thank you. I actually have a copy of that report that you put together, and it's really very impressive. At ACU, we're doing something similar. We're going to be collecting a lot of the evidence, and we're going to be calling on our activists to help us with that. Next week, CPAC, ACU, the American Conservative Union, will be holding CPAC in Texas. And we'll be doing a day of, or an afternoon of training for our activists to help us get more involved, to help them help us with this big fight. So we'll be teaching them things about voter integrity, election integrity, but we'll also be helping them reach out to their congresspeople, make the phone calls. We'll help provide some scripts, writing op-eds, teaching them how to speak about these complicated issues with, their neighbors and so on and so forth. So we are looking forward to that and getting more and more people involved. And I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to speak about what we're doing and congratulate you on the work that you have done, and for South Korea to wish you a very secure, safe election with the desired outcomes that you're looking for.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, John, how about you? What do you?
Well, to our Korea colleagues, friends, I'm very concerned about what happened in Korea. Personally, I served a year in Korea. My father-in-law was wounded twice in 1950 in Korea. We have a great kinship and just a deep relationship. So we want to do whatever it takes to help South Korean and South Korean patriots and conservatives. Again, the key term is organize, train, and equip to beat down this fraud. And it can be done. There's an oppressive censorship that Moon Jae-in has applied to the country. And so I'm very excited and happy to see the organization now occurring. We are undergoing the same thing here in the United States. And again, at the citizen level, I can't overstress, everybody needs to get off the couch and get in the game, because it is us. It is us. That's the grand design of this beautiful process. It is us. It is not lawyers. It is not somebody else. It is not an abstract concept. It's us. And we need to get involved at every county and every state to right the wrongs that clearly occurred last November. And yes, they can be addressed. This is not something to just put aside and walk away from. We can address and right the wrongs that occurred and make sure we have elections of integrity.
Well, thank you. And Professor Choi, you can close it up. Yep.
I'm sending my sincere regard and appreciation to your father, Mr. Mills.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Black Street movement is gaining support from young generation in Korea. I think they are learning through this movement how dangerous totalitarian regime can be and how precious democracy is. So it's kind of very valuable opportunity for giving lessons. I'd like to suggest that probably both countries' citizens or young generation can hold joint Black Umbrella movement at least a couple of times simultaneously or through the cyberspace. So what kind of help is needed from international society? I think international human rights organizations, election monitoring bodies need to pay more attention to this issue. They seem to say that this is a highly political issue and basically domestic issue for them to intervene. However, I think the truth is opposite. This is a very simple matter of truth seeking by non-political group, particularly in Korea. So any transnational, it's very much transnational problem in high technology area. So I think anyone, anybody, any agency who participate and contribute, talk about, support, transfer information about election fraud, I think they should feel proud very much themselves in participating in, can I say, war between humanity and digital fascism.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And it would be nice, actually, to see some of these election watchdog groups pay attention to South Korea, just like they do to the United States. Every country has its concerns. I'd say that one of my earliest memories is my mother telling me that dead people had voted in Chicago. And our distant relative, Richard Nixon, lost the election as a result. And I was about 4 at the time, but I remember it very well. So I guess I've had an interest in election fraud for a long time. But I'd like to thank everyone for joining in, our keynote speakers and also the wonderful panelists, which was a nice sort of a mix of perspectives. And so this is it's an ongoing effort and struggle, and I appreciate what everyone's doing. And I would note that all 3 of the panelists are people who actually do things, as opposed to complaining in the barbershop. But so this is it's been a very nice thing to see. I appreciate it, and thank you for coming. Look forward to seeing you again. And thanks to everyone who tuned in and watches our show. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.